All right. Hello, hello, hello. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, Editor Extensions JetBrains crew for the next few months. I wanted to just get us all together to have an opportunity to talk about the state of the architecture and to just talk about what we'll be working on over the next couple of months. So agenda items are going to be just a clear and open discussion on the state of the architecture of JetBrains. So I'm going to want to have Laura, Aaron, and all of you just have dialogue on what we have right now and how things work currently. It's important for us to understand that. I also want to talk a little bit about the cool stuff. I'll let Aaron take the lead on talking about what's being done language server integration wise. That's still on our plate. Um, and a lot of the language server integration bits that are currently in flight, namely things that John is also doing, is also still on our plate and will still be a part of our roadmap. I also want to talk about future features. This is more about future features that we'll be working on, which are at the bottom below, but also future features that you feel we need. The next thing I want to talk about is existing features. What's working, what needs to be tweaked. Um, is it an architectural thing, or are there things that we need to tweak in terms of the features? And the last bit is more of a high level thing that I want you all to start to consider. As an editor extensions team, we're really responsible for building extensions. And it's important at some point for us to take a step back to say, well, what does the anatomy of an editor extension look like? What are the common patterns that we want to use regardless of whether we're building for JetBrains, whether we potentially might be building for something else? Are there common patterns that we can consistently use? One of those common patterns, obviously, now will probably be integration with the language server. But what are some of the common things that we should constantly think about as we build editor extensions? Because we want to be able to build things a lot faster. I also want us finally to start thinking about kind of the things that we all learned about as engineers: observability, maintainability, scalability, flexibility, the four components of great systems. I want us to start thinking about those things as we build, and also viewing things from an architectural standpoint. I know Laura just put together a cool architectural diagram to walk us through the discussion. So I want to start there, and then I want Aaron to take the lead and start to talk a little bit about what you see vision-wise, John, what you see vision-wise. Let's just have a conversation. So I'm gonna shut up now. I'm gonna pass the baton to Laura and then popcorn over to Aaron. Aaron, I want you to popcorn over to John, and I want this to just be a great party, okay? All right. Laura, you're
I'm
up.
gonna share my screen and show you.
And include the link as well.
Yes, I will do that afterwards. So this is right now in progress. I just started it, so please don't be too harsh. And it's just a documentation that we're gonna have about the architecture of JetBrains. I think my main focus was I had some text as well, which is not necessarily amazing, but like it just states a bit, what we're doing in big words, like general lines. And then I created this picture, which is, again, it's in progress. So it's just like a huge overview of what components and how I see them. And I'm very much open to input from everyone. And what I'm trying to describe here is that on one hand, we have the plugin side. I call it the plugin, which is basically, let's say, the Kotlin code. And then we have the WebView integration, which is the UI, but like the UI happens in like the UI interaction happens within the Kotlin code as well. So I would say the centerpiece of communication between the two of them is the chat service, which I did this on purpose here, where I integrate the chat service and the controller exactly to represent exactly how it looks right now. But right now, like even when you look at this picture, for me, it was very obvious that we need to do a refactoring here, because this chat service only incorporates the controller, which basically does the interaction between the plugin side and the web view side, but they're basically the same thing. So I think here we could definitely do a refactoring where this would be just one place, one single thing. But what's important here is that half of this is communicating with the APIs we have, which are various. Like we have GraphQL integration, Duo API for code suggestions, Path API for token management or getting token information. So let's say this is like the backend, if we would talk in like old school terms. And then half of this, starting from the chat view down, I would see it as the UI integration, the part that is interacting with the user basically. And here it's a communication back and forth, right? Like the plugin communicates at all times with a web view. It's like a message exchanging mechanism, which is maybe not very clearly represented in the architecture. So again, that's why this is just an ongoing open picture that will probably be changed. And here I try to represent what are what can the user do basically? What can they do in our plugin? What are the actions? What are the features? How can they interact with the plugin? And again, this is going to be represented in the Kotlin code as well as in the web view. And like we at all times we had a communication between the two of those. Yeah, this is basically it, the picture that I'm describing. I'm very curious what's your opinion about this. How clear is this? And yeah, like of course there are many other things that are not yet included. Like we have listeners for settings, we have a settings panel. There are many things that are not here yet. At the same time, I would also like to have as much as a clean picture, because then when you start adding everything, it might not necessarily be as some of them might not be as important to add, but yeah, like we will have to like kind of decide how we want this to look and how it's the easiest way to read it. Okay, there are many people.
Yes.
So please,
Awesome. I
John,
think there are a couple of
first.
hands raised. Are you ready are you all ready for questions or ready
Yeah, I'm.
to, okay. So I think
I'm
John is the first up. He's got some input. So John, you're first up, and then Jean Gabriel, and I think Aaron as well.
Sure. This is awesome. Thanks, Laura. The only thing I was going to add was it feels like user action shouldn't go below the chat controller, but instead is something that's contacting the controller. It's actually it's a client of the controller, if that makes sense, rather than it being, because it's not actually connecting directly to the web view. It's going through the controller.
Yeah, I agree. And I think this is one of the things where we can adjust the picture, because the user actions are also part of the UI, right? Like the UI is interpreting it, like the web view is interpreting it as a message, but actions, especially the word actions, because actions is part of the Kotlin code, right? Like you thought exactly the actual actions we have. So yeah, that's something like this, actually this square with the user actions features, it covers half in the Kotlin code and half in the web view. So I agree. Maybe
One piece of feedback that I would have is let's have the ability to discern what is where. So what's Kotlin, what's JetBrains, like what's our backend APIs, what's living in language server, like let's make sure that we're clear on what lives where as these things come through.
So the web view is also part of, it's part of the
Yes.
same repository, right? If you think about it. So web view, it's actually let's say a folder in the whole project, in the JetBrains plugin. So it is part of it, but I think conceptually they are different, because one is more like UI oriented and the other one is more like plugin platform oriented. That's why I wrote here the plugin SDK. So like the Kotlin part, let's say. but they're all part of the same repository. So, but I agree that maybe there should be like a line drawn somewhere in the middle and be like, okay, this is the UI web view side, this is the Kotlin side, which, yeah, I'll think how it will make sense more visually. Jean, you can go next if you want.
Yeah, I'm wondering if we should maybe have a separate one for the code suggestions architecture, because right now I think this one is only focused on the chat for the chat implementation and architecture, because the code suggestions is not communicating with the chat controller and the chat service. So I wonder if we should maybe split
Yeah,
them.
this one actually should be like two squares, right? Yeah, one of
Yeah,
the
let's see. Yeah, because then they could evolve independently. So let's say we add some stuff to the code suggestions like the LSP, we don't have to mess around with the chat boxes and stuff like that, I think. And I also, oh yeah, go ahead, sorry.
Oh no, I was confirming that you're completely right. I focused too much on the chat part, but I completely forgot that should be incorporated with the bigger box that includes the suggestions. I'm taking notes as well, so you can keep going.
And I'm curious how deep should we go for this high level architecture design? Like you were talking about including listeners, and I'm not sure if we want to go that deep
Yeah, so
because
I think that's a question for us. Like we decide that.
Yeah.
We decide what's most important for us. I would first initially go with a more high level thing, like a bit like how it is now, you know, like APIs, like a bit more like loose concepts where that you can use in like interdependent from your platform SDK. And then like kind of zoom into components and see how much in detail we want to get into. But I think it would be really nice to have something more high level zoom out kind of thing initially, at least.
Yeah, I totally agree. The concern I have with when you go too deep into components that these things change a lot and then we forget to update the documentation and we have outdated documentation, which I think is worse than no documentation. So I think focusing on high level stuff like you did is great because those things will rarely change. So
absolutely, and also like building on to the point you mentioned, to have it like, you know, like as much compatible with change. Even this calling it like chat service, chat controller, API client, these are names that if we rename it tomorrow, it doesn't have any significance anymore. So I think here I would really love to come up with some naming that incorporates what it is without actually having to have the name from the code, because that can obviously change.
Got you. So let me give you a quick bit on what I'm one of the types of diagrams that I'm looking for at the highest level. So the first type of diagram, what we're trying to figure out is where we are now, what's next, and what's our North Star. So now, where are we? Meaning, if I am a developer and I'm interacting with JetBrains, what am I hitting first? So I'm making a request to something. What am I hitting first? I want to see that. The second thing is, once it's there, what else is it interacting with? Is it interacting with the language server? Is it interacting with itself? Meaning there's certain things inside of the JetBrains that maybe we want not to be in JetBrains. I want to see exactly what it looks like to make a request to JetBrains and get a response from JetBrains from something. So let's say it's a code suggestion. Walk me through all of the components that it steps through. So it steps through JetBrains, but it also steps through a couple of other things on the back end that allow
like API calls and stuff like that.
We need
so I think what you want to use user flows, right?
First, and then we can get into, okay, well, what's happening in this step? What's happening in this step? Okay, so start high. There should be no more than 5 boxes in terms of it being high. And that might be a lot. So what's happening in JetBrains? What's happening in the language server, if anything? What's happening on the backend? How does that work? How does that request response bit work? And where does things live now?
Okay, cool. I wrote down as a note for myself to create user flows for the features we have right now, Bogdan, I think you're next in the queue.
Oh yeah, I just wanted to ask, does it make sense to move web view to language server? So language server serves the web view and connects to whatever backend API.
That's already something on the agenda, if I'm not mistaken, right, Aaron? So that's
Yes.
a higher
Okay.
discussion, I think. Let's first finish with the questions and suggestions you guys have for this architecture diagram. Of course, I'm going to have an MR, and people are going to be able to like jump in on the MR as well. I already have an MR, but I'm going to update on the MR first. But I would like to first get all the questions and the feedback back based on what I just presented, and then we can continue to the next point if that's all right with everyone.
Awesome.
I think Aaron, did you have some feedback for me or some questions for me maybe?
Yeah, I can take most of my feedback async, but I think sequence diagrams using Mermaid would be a good way to represent it.
Absolutely.
And you
Absolutely.
can have one for each flow, like you sort of mentioned, Laura, having a flow for chat, having a flow for opening a project, where opening a project does certain calls for licensing and stuff like that.
Mhm.
And I'll add that feedback to the MR.
Okay,
And
sweet.
if anyone's not familiar with Mermaid, I will throw that right here, right next to, but put Aaron there. Wait, go ahead, Aaron. Put that there. This is Mermaid. Okay. So next up is, thank you for that, Laura. Everyone, let's make sure that we are collaborating and making the diagram at the high level better, along with the components better. Provide feedback. Let's make sure that we're making things better. I am absolutely a fan of Mermaid. So if you need any help figuring out how to tweak that, feel free to reach out. So, but it's very important for us to see where architecture is now versus next versus North Star. So, Aaron, I'd love for you to talk a little bit about Next and North Star for us, which would include the language server integration.
Cool. So I can walk over the code or just walk over the flow. So what I'll do is I'll just walk over this initial flow for how a user will interact with JetBrains. So when we come in, when it comes down to it, a user will go ahead and open the project. And once that project has been opened, we'll then send that will trigger starting up the plugin. That the GitLab Duo plugin will then run project startup activities. And so right now we have various activities. What we do is we check that there's a configuration. So we ask, can the current personal access token access the API? If we get a 200 okay, we know we can. We collect the user ID at that stage, and then we make additional requests such as, can the user access code suggestions? Does the user have access to Duo chat? So there's GraphQL queries for that. There is queries for Duo chat enabled and whether Duo features are enabled at the project level. And if that's not the case, then we disable stuff. So I'll comment on Laura's MR with the sequence diagrams. But just going from that, what we have is, so this is the sort of like current flow. And what we're changing then is, instead of talking to asking directly to the API, we're gonna be changing some of them to be asking the LSP process. So we'll ask the LSP process, for example. So JetBrains will then talk to the plugin. Our plugin will then reach out to the LSP, sending the specific events around. Can the for the JetBrains plugin, it'll go and ask the LSP. It'll send it. Actually, that's actually inverted, I guess, because what will happen is the LSP, once the LSP is started, we will send a message saying workspace configuration did change, and then that will be processed. But we then get a notification from LSP to the JetBrains plugins saying, so if there's a case of an error, so it will get a message for GitLab token check, and that will include any API errors if the API, if the interaction with that token isn't valid for code suggestions, or in the future it's going to be chat as well. And so the change here is that we're sort of moving to an asynchronous startup process. Right now we're starting up.
Yeah, this is cool.
The startup, it sort of takes a while whenever you're opening the settings pane. Bowden recently made a change where we're like no longer doing the long running on the main thread. but the sort of switch to the language server, because it's event-based, we're in a state where, because with JetBrains we can enable listeners which will receive messages, so we can use this sort of like pub sub or message bus pattern in JetBrains. So that's, in terms of architecture, this is really like the biggest change. We're moving it to be event-based. And the way that's happening is, so for the JetBrains SDK, what we have is the concept of services.
Mhm.
And so Laura, Jean, Gabrielle, and myself, as we've been touching old code, we've been trying to refactor a lot of things to either project or application services.
Mhm.
We previously had a lot of global states being stored. But now what it's come down to is we're starting to use light services where possible. And so in Kotlin land, what that looks like is we add an annotation for each service that's doing a thing. So Laura mentioned chat service. That's a great example of a thing that we implemented as a service. That then has access to your project, and then that project, when you have that, you can use that for dependency injection. So you can say project.service, and you could give it the type of the service you're looking up, and then that will I'm using Spring terms, but that will essentially pull in the dependency from the dependency container that JetBrains SDK provides us.
Mhm.
So in terms of actual implementation details, what I've come up with then is I've created a new settings pane inside of the JetBrains plugin.
Mhm.
And so new settings, I was changing code before this call, so hopefully that doesn't stop me demoing. All right, so that is, all right, if I comment that out and try to run the plugin, you will see. If not, I can just go to my MR. Okay, cool. Yeah, I'll just go to my MR and show a screenshot of the panel. But
Just
essentially what I've
include
done,
your MR in the agenda so that everybody can take a peek.
yeah, all good. So it's a 5512, and I can drop that in the agenda afterwards
Mhm.
once I have my screens in check. But yeah, so what we have then is, instead of having the traditional GitLab Duo settings pane, so right now that settings pane was using a lot of states sort of across the application, some singletons and stuff like that.
Mhm.
To simplify that, I've created a nested state.
Mhm.
We're also, the default settings panel is also getting quite busy with different settings for unrelated things. And because there's so many settings for the language server, what I've done is you can see the little like the square icon window.
Mhm.
That little, like that icon, the iconography there is referring to the fact that that is project specific settings. So the default state for GitLab Duo is like accounts level settings or instance level settings. And so if you set that once inside of the window, that will apply for all of your different project windows. And so that causes some issues with like not having support for multiple instances. It causes issues with if you change your path in one window, if they give multiple accounts and stuff like that, you don't have the opportunity to select things. So that there's an issue already around this sort of application versus project state.
Mhm.
It describes how we may want to change that in the future. But but for the scope of the language server, this project level settings
Mhm.
defines how we're going to start up the language server process. And so this maps pretty much exactly with what we have in VS Code, NeoVim, and Visual Studio.
Mhm.
These settings are copied over as workspace settings. We also have access to the GitLab project right now, which you can then forward that project path into this project service.
Aaron, do me a favor. Give the crew insight on why this frees us up next. Why does this free us up next? And how does it free us up next?
For sure. I think going back to the agenda, so sort of it touches on to the next point. Let's see, I'm trying to think of the order. Am I gonna overlap with, no, that's good. Okay, so existing features, right? So what we have today is we have a case where VS Code and LSP, just because they're both TypeScript and because VS Code is our most popular editor extension, we rapidly developed features and then put them in VS Code. So a lot of the time that means we get left behind in JetBrains. because JetBrains we sort of do it as like a close follow basis so far. So sometimes we lag 2 weeks behind, sometimes it's even 1 milestone behind before we are able to do generally available features inside of the JetBrains IDE. So the motivation is by using the language server, that frees us up to say that if the backend sort of portion, the chat controller or the code suggestions provider is implemented in the language server, then we're able to use that as a client from JetBrains to get those benefits instantly instead of having to do a follow-up like after the fact.
Makes
There's
sense.
also yeah.
That makes sense. So by using the language server or integrating with language server, we're able to use the client to get feature benefits immediately. Meaning,
Yep.
in many ways, we will have to build less or build once. Continue, Aaron.
Absolutely, and that's exactly it. If we start using the language server and we start putting like the sort of logic into the language server for functionality, we get into a case where not only are we benefiting JetBrains by having earlier access to features that we implement in LSP, but we're also benefiting our whole ecosystem of editor extensions. So Visual Studio and NeoVim, two of our extensions that we have in support, we're not able to give that much love and attention to. Those will instantly become the difference is instead of implementing something once in VS Code, once in JetBrains, and then once again in either of those other extensions, we implement an LSP, and then for the extensions in the front end, you're just doing front end work or sort of integration work where you're doing glue code. So you're passing in some extra settings maybe for feature flags, and then you're actually connecting to an LSP method and then taking the data and then rendering that in some way to the user.
Awesome, awesome. Any other questions? Looks like Anna has a question. Feel free to voice your question, Anna.
Yeah, I was just curious, like in that settings panel, what would it mean if somebody didn't have enable GitLab language server check?
Yeah, that's a great question. So right now, for Duo code suggestions, the reason to have that is to sort of give a workaround if we weren't happy with the quality of the release. So depending on when we're going to be pushing this out, we want to make sure it's a quality release of the code suggestion provider. We already have code suggestions available in JetBrains, and we don't want to start supporting the language server, but not be confident in it. So we want to get internal users testing on various platforms. Right now, we have language server for NeoVim and language server for Visual Studio being used outside of VS Code. VS Code comes with a node runtime though, and so just for the nature of shipping your own node runtime, there are going to be platform issues. And so having the ability to disable the language server in the short term while we make sure we iron out those platform issues is going to be a big deal. Like this milestone, the majority of what I've been doing though is ironing out platform issues. So Mac OS, for example, has code signing, which is enforced on binaries. And so that's something I've had to do. I've had to work with IT security to get a provision certificates and API keys to actually go ahead and like use Apple Store Connect to sign the binaries in a way that when anybody runs JetBrains on their Mac, the language server will actually start, because right now it will be killed by default based on how we're shipping the binaries today, because we don't properly code sign. We're doing like ad hoc signing, which before last week, whenever you actually couldn't run the binary on Mac. And now since last week, you can go and right click it in Finder, but that's still a barrier to entry for users having to go through enabling the binary and then alternatively having to have a node runtime to work around the fact that the Mac binary isn't signed. And so it's to be able to release in iterations, right? Is essentially, I guess, the quick answer, right?
Awesome, awesome. Any questions before we move on to the next topic? Awesome. So Aaron, you're talking about existing features or future features? Which one do you want to touch on next?
Yeah, for sure. I can open up the feature parity issue. And so for code suggestions, what we have is this issue is confidential. I'm trying to think. It's like I can
Let me
I'll
pause. Let me pause.
Oh, you're good. No, the recording is fine. I've paused my screen if you haven't already paused the recording. and I can carry on. Nothing in the top of the issue is confidential or say like unsafe information. There's one that's potentially unsafe, but it's not documented or anything, but it's fine. I can talk about that after the recording if we want to, or
Mhm.
people can look at the confidential issue themselves and they'll see which issue it is.
Add that issue as well to the
So
doc.
with this feature comparison charts though, what this table provides is it provides information around the various features we have in VS Code, the various capabilities and pre-processing and post-processing of our code suggestions, and there's functionality that's released in a language server that is not supported in VS or it's in VS Code and the language server, but it's not supported by JetBrains. Excuse me, because we're not tying into it. And so the main sort of contenders here would be things like the language server would or VS Code would support OAuth for authentication. There is authentication of different accounts. So right now you can't have different accounts inside of the JetBrains plugin. So we would want to add the capability to have different accounts in some way. There's a backing off when code suggestion requests are failing. So if requests are failing, right now JetBrains will keep sending requests. But what we have in LSP is a circuit breaker pattern. So if we hit a certain number of errors, it'll stop attempting and it'll back off exponentially until it'll try again later. And depending on the error, if it's like an error with authentication, we'll show the user a notification. Whereas right now you get like one error, like you get like an error in the corner, but we don't like prompt you necessarily more than once. And then some people you can disable notifications, JetBrains, and you'll never see the error, right? Unless you go and manually verify your setup. Um, there is a couple of these who got finished, but there's like gutter icons weren't previously supported in JetBrains. That got added in the last milestone. There is, I'm going to skip over one of the issues here, but the next issue is streaming code suggestion requests or code generation requests. So we don't do any code generation for code generation, which is sort of typically under a comment or within the empty body of a the empty body of a method. That is something we don't currently do, or we don't. That seems sorry. So when you're doing code generation, that request takes a longer period of time to return to the user. And so right now with JetBrains, it looks like JetBrains isn't doing anything, and it's actually processing that in the backend because we're allowing the monolith or even rather the AI gateway is actually processing that request with the AI model. So it's waiting on the AI model. AI gateway then returns to GitLab.com or the GitLab instance or the monolith rather. And then that will then be returned eventually to the user. So that could take multiple seconds. And then as a user typing an editor, that's a very long running action. Whereas if you enable streaming, you get inline completions streamed to your screen. So every sort of few words, every like sentence, you'll see the code dropping into your editor.
Trickling in like the Matrix.
You'll feel it trickling in sort of immediately. And so the perceived performance is much greater. You can see that there's work being done as opposed to you seeing like a little loading icon in the gutter. Because right now people's like, oh, it's really slow. But really it's creating a lot of context and actually provides really good code sometimes. But folks don't see that and they might start editing again. So that's the sort of code streaming method. And that sort of plays into using tree sitter. Allows us to do the intent detection, which we don't do today in JetBrains. Today in JetBrains, we just send the inline or the completion request up to the AI gateway. And then the AI gateway determines based on the documents and your position in the document what your intent may have been. But if you were to use tree sitter, you're able to locally from the client side detect, hey, I'm on this line of code, blah, blah, blah. And I'm like under a code comment. And if you're under a code comment, we're able to do that up front. And so if we're under a code comment and we think we want to do generation from the editor and we detect that on the client side, we stream the request immediately. Whereas if you stream a request for code completion, which is like after a dot or after a space or something, then you try to finish the statement, you get into a situation where you don't where you get into the situation where you're like trying to stream, but there's no reason to stream, and like you're trying to use the like a more I would say less resilient. There's some like functionalities we have inside of language server to protect against errors happening when we try to do streaming. But what ends up happening is like, code completion is really quick and there's almost no latency doing that. So just it's more performance if you say, hey, just do a completion request. And so instead of letting the AI gateway do all the detection logic and run the trees that are all over again because we already did it locally, we're able to just trust what the client says
Right.
because we consider, and we're able to say what we want, what type of code suggestion we want, whether it's completion or generation.
Awesome.
And then finally, language server also has support for code suggestion languages. And so that's one of the feature parity things as well. We don't have support for custom languages. We have like a hard-coded list right now in the JetBrains plugin, and potentially you could do that outside of language server. But that, there's a number of items here that I've sort of mentioned would come for free if we implemented language server.
Got you.
So
Got you.
yeah,
With a focus on free 99. Free 99 is an amazing price that language server can provide if we move closer and closer toward making sure that integration happens and that we are using things out of the box that are available to us.
sure. And
thank-
yeah, I was just gonna popcorn to John at this stage.
Yes.
Like the next piece to talk about, and I'm gonna make sure John gets time is do a chat. Right
Yeah.
now right now it's within JetBrains. We have parity, but it was a big hustle to get parity, and John has some pretty exciting stuff to talk about for how we beat that curb and how we don't have to follow VS Code.
Awesome. Thanks, Aaron. Yeah, really, you hit the nail on the head in that there's a huge cost to bring chat to other extensions right now, which means that if we were bringing chat to Visual Studio or we wanted to bring chat to another IDE, we're essentially going back to scratch, importing whatever we have, copy pasting, making changes to try to get this to work, re-implementing our controllers for chat in a new environment, and then once you have that all up and running, then you're in the process of going, well, any change that needs to be made, you have to make in every extension. And so the goal was, well, this sounds like a job for the language server because that's where our shared functionality should sit. And especially because we want to have parity across these web views anyways. And so, yeah, I don't have an awesome visualization that everybody else had, but I was chatting with Angelo the other day, and I threw up a little Excalidraw while I was chatting, and I think I can go over the high-level architecture really quickly. I plan on doing some Mermaid documentation just to explain the flow, but essentially, what we're looking at is
And John,
the
share
language
this
server
when you're
hosts.
done. Share this with us when you're done.
Yes, absolutely. I will. Essentially, what is the idea is the language server, the repository for the language server is where we'd be writing plugins for web views. These web views would take on the form of two sides. One is the actual web view front end application. So at the end of the day, we're getting web resources like some HTML, CSS, JavaScript, and we have two ways of serving that to a extension. We have our traditional method so like VS Code, where we import, do an npm install of the language server, and we actually bundle in, hey, by the way, here's all of our web resources for different web views. We would be able to say, hey, it's the same way you're doing it today. There's a folder, grab web views off that folder, and it's a deterministic path. The other way that would work for other desktop-based applications would be the language server would also expose a small HTTP server where we could actually serve web resources the standard web way over HTTP. And the HTTP server would also support WebSockets for communication directly back to the language server. This way, we don't need to implement any special logic in our extensions to support proxying messages back to essentially our controller for so each plugin that would be written would be given two things: some abstractions around how to communicate with the web view itself, which is the actual front end application, and a message bus and abstraction to communicate with the extension. This way, we can handle things like the extension is requesting, explain this code to me, or write tests for this code, things like that. So we can subscribe to messages that the extension is going to send us. We can also send messages back to the extension to say, I want to tell my extension, I want you to open up this web view. Or I want the extension to say, I mean, we could tell the extension, hey, close your current solution, you know, and as long as there's a, you know, a handler for that, these are things that, you know, we would set up. This would be communication that would be set up on both sides of both the extension and the plugins. But then that WebView plugin then handles all of the heavy lifting for anything we're doing right now inside a chat controller, or and handle all things like streaming, everything like any communication with the API we're doing today related to chat would happen in this plugin. And the reason I'm calling plugins is because I have abstracted to a point where we can easily create additional web views inside of the language server just by registering these, registering a plugin, which a plugin right now is just an identifier for what is this and what is, and then you get a setup function which gives you back these individual message buses.
Awesome.
And yeah, then the other key piece is that there are different transports for how web views can communicate back to, well, how the plugin communicates to the web view and how the web view communicates back.
Walk us through that, John. Walk us through the different transports.
So the one that I would say that it's kind of what we would do in, let's start with the web IDE, because I think this, well, no, I'm going to start with WebSockets because that's actually simpler. Okay. This is the idea behind WebSockets is that you have a web view, which is hosted by the extension, but the web view is served by the HTTP server in the language server. So, but then at that point, the web view just communicates directly to the web view plugin through this WebSocket. It does not need to communicate back to the extension at all. The only thing the extension is doing is hosting its tool window to say, here's a web view. And here's the URL that you need to that we need to point the web view towards. We need to route it towards. So WebSockets are really, really simple. The JSON RPC plugin, or the JSON RPC transport, essentially requires that the extension have some sort of basic communication service that the web view would communicate with. So for VS Code, if anyone who's looked at the VS Code way of doing this, there's like a VS Code web view API where you can post messages to, and you can receive messages from the extension. And what we would need to do is when we're posting messages to the extension essentially is proxying or forwarding those messages on to the language server over JSON RPC. Over a channel that, you know, probably looks something like, probably something like, you know, GitLab, WebView, instance, and then probably like something message. This is like the JSON RPC channel that we would communicate over, the method name, you know. And there's a few of these that would also be related as well, because we need to understand the WebView lifecycle. So the extensions are when they're communicating over those transports, either the JSON RPC transport, or in this case, the WebSocket transport. We need to know when a web view has been created, when a web view has been destroyed. So there are going to be lifecycle methods that we would see on, let me go back over to the message bus. The extension message bus will have 3 different events that we can tie to. More could grow out of this, but right now we have a web view has been created, a web view has been destroyed, and a web view has sent a message. And we would expect that people are, well, that's actually the transport. The transport would do that. And then the transport would then send off to the message bus a fully typed. So when you create a plugin, you also create what are my expected messages. so that we have a strongly typed message bus. Now, strongly typed is a funny word because we are at a domain boundary here, and so we're still making the assumption that no one's done anything wrong with their, no one's just bypassed the type system and moved on. But the nice thing about this is that when we create this plugin with our strongly typed messages, we can share that directly with our front end code, which will actually be the and so then we would get a strongly typed message from the front end and the back end.
And so for JetBrains, obviously we would use the WebSocket transport.
We would use the WebSocket transport. We
And
absolutely.
also, would we
Visual Studio would
also,
use the WebSocket. Yeah, go ahead.
sorry, would we also, for future editor extensions, we would also potentially consider the WebSocket transport as something that's reusable that can be used for new extensions that we potentially will roll out? Just question.
Absolutely.
Got it.
Yes, for the most part, I would say WebSocket is our best transport. I think that would be the cleanest approach.
Okay. Cool.
And not needing any kind of proxying, and we don't have to write specific editor code to
I'm
proxy
looking
those
at
messages.
that, and that's I love it. I'm with Aaron. I love Transport One, particularly because I know that we're gonna potentially, possibly, most likely build new editor extensions, and this just feels cleaner and reusable.
Absolutely.
Any other thoughts?
The only reason we would need Transport 2 are in cases like the Web IDE where we cannot support we can't support running an HTTP server or WebSockets. And there was talk about using something like we could fake it with like a web worker or something. And it made a lot more sense just to build out a separate transport.
All right.
Yeah. So anyways, I'll stop the share there, but I will post all those things. But this is currently in flight. The work that's being done on the language server is all the infrastructure work is being done this iteration. The goal being that the next iteration I'm starting work pulling stuff. I'm actually starting to port chat over. So we should hopefully see chat very soon in the language server.
Got you. Thank you, John. We're running a little bit short on time, so I'm going to speed this up a little bit. Bogdan, do you have a question before we move on? Bogdan, do you have a question?
Just a thought. Did you consider any other transports, like gRPC or something like that?
I didn't consider anything else. It doesn't mean that may not be a better one. WebSockets just went top of mind and wrote a POC to get that to work. And I was like, okay, that'll work. That'll work for what we're doing. That doesn't mean we couldn't use something like gRPC.
All right. So we're going to move on to future features section. I'm going to wait on that one because we're going to talk about dual acceleration, and that includes one of the future features. That's a tongue twist. You know what I'm trying to say. That word. Yeah, there we go. We're going to move forward, and then we'll talk about that at the tail end. So anatomy of an editor extension. Aaron, you're up.
All right. Yeah, I think we covered different extensions fairly well. Sorry, clearing my throat. Yeah, when we're thinking of editor extension, it's important to to look at the different extensions that we have. So if I was to go to my Duo, editor extensions have a few different touch points right now. So there's the native components of the extension. So right now, Duo Chat, we render a web view inside of the side panel, or the naming can change a little bit. But as you can see, what we end up having is on the right-hand side, you end up getting a Duo Chat panel. You can then have different key mappings. The key bindings are native components of the editor extension or the IDE that you're in. And so you can define those. You then, when you're running chats right now, each extension today for chat is manual. That is to say, VS Code and the JetBrains extensions currently render web view. So they both have their own Vue.js application, which John talked about potentially moving over to hosting it in the language server. But today what we have is we have these editor extensions, which have message handlers and the sort of transports. That's something that we have to define manually per extension right now. So if we go to the chat controller that Laura mentioned earlier, what you can see is this extension has all the logic for clearing the window and then passing messages back and forth from the chat view, which the chat view then is the actual like implementation of the web view. So if we go to the chat client, and I go to implementations of this, we can see there's API service. And so this is actually binding. So the IDE, the extension itself, the editor extension, is the API client to the GitLab API. It is the API client for the GraphQL API. So whenever we're doing subscriptions, GraphQL subscriptions for GitLab are using the action cable protocol. So not using the standard WebSocket protocol and WebSocket GraphQL WS standard. But we're actually using action cable. So there's like a custom network transport here. And that's something that we have to support for all extensions today in action cable transport, which we have for JetBrains. We have that, and we also have that for so we have that for JetBrains, and we have that for VS Code extension. But then we also have to have the API client library, so they have to create an interface for interacting with the API for any different GraphQL or REST requests that we want for GitLab. Then off the back of that, then it's just really creating the sort of the concept of a workspace because we're sort of trying to standardize on using LSP. LSP defines like a workspace root as the sort of like your root folder in the project that you open. So in JetBrains, that's a project, but you can have multiple folders as well. So in that case, you end up having workspace folders. So you can have one or more workspace folders. The first one you have, it would be like the root folder, but then potentially in the future we may want to like optimize that. The reason that's important is because the workspace is usually, but not always, where the git like your git configuration file is, which tells you where your git upstreams are, which tells you where your GitLab project is, and that GitLab project ties you to what features can be enabled or disabled. In the case of like AI ban, so if the Duo features have been disabled, if you don't have access to Duo chat in your particular instance, that sort of URL, that project URL, which includes your GitLab instance, host name, as well as your project path, which includes the group you're in. Those all come into play with how we request APIs. So, and then as I mentioned, we have a project startup. So the project startup is slightly different for every extension, but we generally have this type of concept. And the way we do it for JetBrains is we have a project activity. So whenever a new project window is opened, we go through and start running different tasks. It's best to do these asynchronous if we can, and we've been doing a better job recently of moving towards doing that for JetBrains. But these can be like requests that take time, right? And the reason that matters is because 1 or 2 seconds of extra project start time can really make it feel like as a user of an IDE. So what we have then is we have the code suggestion status and the Duo chat status. Those are the two main ones right now. But essentially what we have is we have the concept of feature status or feature enablement. And a feature can span across multiple GitLab versions. So if we introduce a beta or experimental feature, a lot of the time that'll be associated with the feature flag. So then to know whether it's enabled or not, we have to go call the GitLab API. We have to check our token scopes. We have to know we're using a valid personal access token. So there's some complications there. Actually, I've started a proposal. I have a draft proposal around feature sets. I would like to introduce the concept of feature sets, which essentially tracks the milestones where features are introduced. That includes the token scopes required, so your minimal permissions. That's important for use cases. GitLab is a one user as such, where we don't, like with our token management standard, maintainers of projects shouldn't be giving API level access to random extensions, right? And so obviously we maintain the extension, we can trust it, but If there's a malicious extension in an editor, or even in your shell environment, it could steal your API access token, right? And so that's not something we want to encourage. We want to be able to provide minimal access. So we've produced a more granular token scopes already. And the reason I'm mentioning this is because the feature set matters and the UX matters based on your token scope. So if you're pointing at a GitLab dot 8 instance, 16.8, versus your editor extension code was developed against 17.1, you're getting to a case where if you don't test backwards compatibility of your changes, and if you're making API requests that have fields in it that aren't supported, you're going to get bad requests or you're going to get access denied based on the token scopes. And in some cases, what we request that you increase your token scopes, your token access. But if a feature request later has updates to it where we update the feature to require less privileges, that type of thing is something that like comes into the editors, right? So that's sort of like concept of a feature set, which applies to across different GitLab milestones, right? Because your self-managed instances, dedicated instances are always one milestone behind what GitLab.com is. GitLab.com is usually you have like when you have your release candidates, you have this sort of like active version. It then very quickly after the release is stable, we go to like it's sort of like it's whatever the main branch is running, right? We do our occasional deploys for staging and production, but very quickly you can actually be ahead of all self-managed customers, even the most up-to-date self-managed customer. GitLab.com will be ahead of them. So we're going to be in a situation where you're testing against GitLab.com, but really customers are going to be hitting against like a tagged version of the code. So whenever we're making queries and stuff, we have to try to make it robust by adding in a lot of like defensive logic and thinking about, okay, for this particular feature set, what token scopes matter, what feature flags matter, are there project level settings, are there group level settings? And so that's something that we require for all extensions. And
Make
for
sure
Duo,
you include a link to your feature set proposal so that everyone
we'll-
can start getting up to speed and provide some feedback on it within the document for sure.
for sure. I'm not running the latest version of this extension, but I was going to show Jean-Gabriel's recent change to show the different health check.
Yes,
So
and like bravo to round of applause to Jean Gabriel. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. He's done a couple of cool bits working with Dylan and also working with Aaron. So just round of applause for just jumping in head first and trying to solve some of our major challenges. So just round of applause to you. I think we're running out of time, but I do want to say a couple final things. Reference section for ramp up list for you, Anna and Bogdan. Please feel free to continue to use the issue list as a way to ramp up and get comfortable with what's happening. Couple of announcements. We finally have a UX resource, so please reach out to him. We'll be working with him. I'm sure everyone is extremely excited. And we do have a new crew member that will be joining us in a couple of weeks. Carl, he'll be joining us on July 2nd. So please feel free to reach out to him on LinkedIn, but he'll be joining the team. He has Kotlin, Java, and JavaScript experience, so he should be able to help us with what we're doing now, what we're doing in the future, and also any LS integration bits that we need. Finally, we did have a chance, Andre and I did have a chance to rally and speak with Dasha and product, and the themes for Duo acceleration are below. So supporting us extending the user languages list, that's a definite one. John, I'd like you to run point on that, okay? OAuth authentication epic. Laura, this is a multi-milestone bit. I'd like you to run point on beginning to create the epic and work with the team to figure out high level, again, diagrams on how our OAuth system works right now, because there are setup challenges, so that we can start to create a multi-milestone epic to address some of our OAuth authentication bits and our setup challenges. I think some of what our customers are experiencing relates more to setup in OAuth than it potentially may relate to the extension itself. So we want to take a close look at that and do a deep dive to understand exactly how OAuth works, view-wise, and how can we make that process better. Third, language server integration. Aaron, you're running, you're running point. So on that. So, and for telemetry, Dylan, I want you running point on this, which means that you're going to have to reach out to all of the players here and get feedback and support. I'm going to have Laura tag team with you. Make sure you're pairing with Jean. And also, Bogdan, I want you to jump in and also help with telemetry so that you can get more comfortable. Anna, please support Laura on any OAuth things or anything that John needs. So step in. Unless Aaron needs you on point, but I believe Jean-Gabriel and him will be working on the language servers bits.
For the
Yes.
for the epic around authentication, is that OAuth specifically for supporting OAuth tokens, or is authentication the full authentication flow per personal access tokens and OAuth?
Our mandate was to resolve some of the challenges with OAuth authentication. But if you believe that it should be a larger epic, cool, work with Laura so that we can create a larger epic, and the sub epic that we create first could be OAuth authentication, if that makes sense. But connect with Laura. And if you feel like we need a larger one as a team, and the first sub epic would be something that we're working on, make sure that you're working with Laura, because we want to make sure that that is super comprehensive. And we are defining things in a parallelizable way, similar to what we've done with the stuff that we've done with DaVinci. I want to see all epics. I'm visual. I need visuals. I need mermaid diagrams. I need those things in our bits so that we can move forward and make sure that the work is parallelizable. Lastly, fantastic job to everybody. You all have been working super hard. I want you to take some time this weekend to just enjoy yourselves. We've got a lot of stuff to do this summer, but you all are doing an exceptional job, and we're trying to ramp up as quickly as possible. I know we're over time, but are there any questions? And this has been was this a good flesh out for everyone? Do you feel like you can do some follow-ups together? You don't need me to do follow-ups. Feel free to add more architectural huddles to the calendar so that you're all on the same page. But I'm hoping that this was a good kickoff so that you can all start to begin to think about ways to make our system more observable, more maintainable, more scalable, and more reusable. Those are the things that I'm going to be looking for from everything that we build. That's all I've got, but any questions?
I just wanted to add to what Maverick said. So I know that GitLab is normally like super async, super like disconnected a bit with the communication. But I think in our case, because we're just starting and it's like a lot of things to go over and a lot of maybe pairing needed. I think I wanted to say to everyone to not like always go for pair programming if you feel like it, and contact people. It's not a problem at this point in time, at least for me personally. So I'm only talking about myself. But yeah, if you need any like setting up sessions and meetings and all that, then yeah.
And one final thing, milestone 17.2 planning officially begins next week. So I'll be connecting with each of you to talk about assignments. I want you to think about what you want to work on now that you know what layer you'll be working on. Nothing changes. You're still a part of decisions, meaning I want to know what you want to work on. Nothing changes. Let's just make sure that we're focused on the layer that you're focused on. And that's it. Have a wonderful, wonderful Thursday, you all.
Bye.
Bye-bye.